So I think we could get right into the conversation for today and get into the topic. And maybe first just introduce our guest. With us, we have Hester Reilly. Holly's somebody that has spoken at our conference, the product conference before, is one of our speakers coming up at the New York product conference. And Holly, it's going to be awesome to get to see you soon.
Yeah, I'm super excited. I can't wait to have you back in New York.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun for sure. And this conversation here is going to be a lot of fun as well. We're set to talk about metrics that matter, specifically in product experimentation, though. And that I think actually I was speaking to a marketing club at Case Western Reserve University last night, and the topic came up about experiments and how do we track experiments, and is it important to be tracking experiments? And these were MBA students, and so it was an awesome conversation. But I'm like, hey, you all should probably come to a conversation we're hosting tomorrow with Product Collective in this industry interview. But yeah, maybe just sort of getting right into the topic. Why, when it comes to experimentation, especially, why are the metrics that we're using to track those experiments? Why is that so important?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that I see is people doing what they think of as experimentation, but without having a real goal of what they're trying to learn, other than just, does it work? We're not, we're not doing enough if we just show up to an experiment trying to figure out, well, how do people feel about it? We want to have a really specific goal. Like maybe we're trying to figure out how many people drop off in the funnel, or maybe we're trying to figure out, what I spend a lot of time with is engagement with actual, people who are already in a product, like how they're engaging with the product. And so maybe we're trying to figure out, well, if we have designed it this way, do users use that feature that we built? We need to have a really specific question so that we can know what success looks like and how to decide whether the hypothesis that we went into the experiment with was true or false. And so that's like a key word there, which is the hypothesis. Like you'll get a lot more out of your experiments if you go into it with a hypothesis that's very clear and is stating what you think you're going to be seeing, and then you can compare your results to that hypothesis. And that hypothesis should have a metric in it. Like we expect that 30% of users will engage with feature X. And then that way you have something, a baseline, and you can see what happens when you run the experiment.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of my questions going to be, because I know, every company is so different. You have, and we'll get to audience questions in just a bit. I already see some of them coming in, which is awesome. But, different types of companies, whether it's I'm a B2B company in the SaaS world, or I'm an enterprise company, or there's B2C companies. So I imagine every company and every kind of product might have their own set of, metrics that would be appropriate. But how do we think those through? How do we think it through what the right kind of metrics are? And it sounds like maybe you were starting to allude to it, which is, what are the questions we're trying to ask ourselves? What are the hypotheses we have? Maybe you can expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah. So I'm a really big fan of a perspective that I actually first learned from a guy named Josh Ellman, which is measure the growth of user value. I think no matter what industry, what discipline you're practicing in, if you can figure out, well, what is the core thing in our application, in our product, that is delivering value to the end user? And the way that I think about that is actually to separate out, what problem are we solving for the user and what outcome do they want to get to? And then can we measure whether they're getting to that outcome? So I'll give you an example to make it a little more concrete. So when I was working on Shutterstock Editor, we were creating a tool for non-professional designers to create great looking images. So the idea was, you can come in, you can download your stock content, and then right in the application, you can crop it, you can filter it, you can put text on top of it. A lot of our users were just using the stock photography for social media, and they had very minimal needs about what kind of changes they needed to make. So when we were deciding how to measure success for launching a new feature within Editor, we were saying to ourselves, well, are users getting to their end goal of creating a great looking image for social media? In an ideal world, we would have built out functionality that actually tracks, like connects to posting, so we can know, did this image make it to social? But we had to start somewhere a little bit less grand. And so we started with, well, are they actually downloading the edited images more than 5 times. Because that way we could tell that they were actually getting something done for their job with our product. And we were able to measure the percent of people who downloaded images that were edited. And they downloaded at least 5 of those edited images. And so there ends up being some layers in there, but at the end of the day, we're measuring whether they're getting to their desired outcome with our solution.
Yeah. It's really helpful to think it through that way. By the way, as a quick aside, Josh Ellman is an Ohio guy. Little known fact.
Little known
I believe
facts. There you
he's
go.
from Kent, Ohio, not too far from Cleveland. But thank you for that, for approaching it that way, because I think it's helpful for us to think about like again, what are the questions we're trying to ask ourselves, and how can we get an answer to those questions? And one of the things I want to run by you, and I think like what you just said sort of helps give an answer to it already, but the various stages that our product is in. Like I imagine how we're approaching experimentation in the ideation phase of our product versus maybe the scale up phase of our product. I imagine things change, but maybe is it just that like, well, the reality is those questions we're asking ourselves, those hypotheses we're setting in place, those are changing. And so therefore the metrics change. Or is there more to it? Like maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that the questions we're asking are changing and therefore the metrics change. But I think there's also the element that, when you're super early on in a new product, you don't have the scale, right? So you're not A/B testing everything that you're going to put out because you don't, you're probably not even in market yet. Like, so in that super early, that ideation phase, the tools that you have available to you as you run experiments are different, and the scale you have available to you as you run experiments is different. And so you have to match the metrics that you're measuring to that. So for example, I almost always, at the same time as we go out and do some competitive understanding and what's going on in the market, I'm always starting with qualitative interviews with customers because I want myself and my team to have that deep empathy for the end user. So in that early stage, what I'm usually looking for is some kind of measure of the depth of the pain that I heard in the customers that I spoke to. And so in my way of thinking, like that's also a kind of experiment. It's not an A/B test, right? But it is a way to go out and test, put some kind of prompts in front of people, in this case, questions, and see how they respond. And that is you tie that with a hypothesis, and that is the scientific method, right? You have a hypothesis, you go out and you test something, you see what happens. So in those early stages, a lot of times the metrics that matter are like what percent of people, expressed a certain level of pain in the conversation about the topic that we are probing, right? So if we think that we can find people who experience this pain, and then only 3 out of 10 people that we spoke to have it, then we're not finding the depth of the pain that we need to find for there to be a valuable product there.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you brought up like interviewing customers, because qualitative feedback, that's data too. It's a different kind of data. And there was something I was curious about though, like the balance of qualitative versus quantitative when we're trying to run experiments, we're trying to, look at metrics and try to gather data and all of that. Does that balance how does that balance change again throughout sort of the product life cycle? You talked about in those beginning stages, those interviews being really important. Are they just as important in later stages, or maybe we can talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, they're just as important in later stages. But what happens is in the later stages, your access to data grows to a point where, it's also equally important. Whereas when you're in that super early ideation stage, as important as data is, you often just don't have as much access to it. When you get to the later stages, you have a wealth of data available to you, ideally. And if you don't, you should be instrumenting to make sure that you do. Um, and so in those later stages, it doesn't mean that the qualitative is any less important, but it does mean that you have to pair it with quantitative. And the way that I like to think about this at all of the stages is that the qualitative tells you the what and the why. And the quantitative tells you the how much and the how many. And so
Mhm.
I always pair it together to say, well, what did I learn in the qualitative? What pains was I seeing? What themes are we empathizing with? And then how can I start to quantify that with the quantitative side? So a lot of people think about, product metrics, right? Like the engagement within the product, or, conversion rates, churn, there's so many common product metrics. And I think you can find a lot of information about that. Um, but on top of that, I also do a lot of strategic level of quantitative analysis where it's really looking at, well, how many people feel that pain as deeply as, user A who is so excited with my product? And can I quantify that by running a survey or some kind of analysis of existing product data that helps me see, are other people like them, or was that really excited early adopter an outlier?
Yeah. I'm gonna take an audience question here, because we already have one coming in. And by the way, if you have other audience questions out there, definitely keep those coming in, for sure. So the question is, when it comes to B2B experimentation, do you have any recommendations on how to approach that? Would it be different from, again, if you're running a B2C type of product? Like, what are the factors that are changing? How do we think about this differently? How do we approach it different, or should we be approaching it any differently? Do you have feedback on those that are trying to run B2B types of
Yeah,
experiments?
absolutely. So I do a lot of B2B work. And what I find is that depending on the stage of the company that you're working within, the scale of data that you have access to can be significantly different.
Mhm.
And so you need to be comfortable with looking at product usage data for, maybe it's a few hundred clients as opposed to hundreds of thousands of users, right? I've worked at companies where the business is running $500 million of revenue through it, but there's only 500 people who use the software. And so your access to experimentation looks different, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means that you're going to have different tools. You're probably not going to do as much A/B testing, but you are going to do a lot of product usage data analysis.
Yeah, that's helpful. I appreciate that. And thanks again for that audience question. Keep those coming in. I'll get to as many of your questions as I can here. Probably better than my questions. So keep those coming in. I did want to ask about vanity metrics. This is something that I know, like for me, I, well, we all like to think that, oh, the metrics we're tracking are really important. These are the right metrics, should be really important. But we can get caught in the trap of vanity metrics, and maybe some of those metrics aren't as important as we think that they are. Maybe some of those metrics sound good, but when you dig in further, they don't actually mean as much as we think that they do. How can we approach our metrics in a way where we're decreasing the chances that those metrics we're tracking are actually just vanity metrics and aren't really all that meaningful?
Yeah. So I think you have to ask yourself a couple questions. The first question that you want to ask yourself is, does this metric have a meaningful reference to it? So what I mean by that is, like, am I comparing it to last month, last year? Am I comparing it to competitors? Am I comparing it to other features in the same product? Or is it just a static number? If you don't have a reference, if you're not comparing it to something that is going to provide some context for you, then that makes it much more likely that it is a vanity metric, because you're just looking at, like, I'll give you an example. When I was working at Shutterstock, they always love to keep track of, like, how many stock assets are on the platform. That is, like, so useless, because actually, if you have, a billion stock assets on the platform and you don't have a good search function, that doesn't help at all. What you really need is like 100,000 of the most highly curated, amazing stock images, rather than, a billion, right? And that is a number that the references, the only reference that you could kind of think of for that is, well, maybe we're comparing it to our competitor's amount of stock, right? And so I think that's a place where, like, if you're comparing it to a competitor's number, you should give yourself a second layer of checking to see if it's a vanity metric. The other thing is, does it convey user value? So, is this a measure of the users getting value, or is this a measure of something else? Because it is very important. Like, I always like to talk about things at the user level and the product level and the business level as like three tiers that we can look at metrics at. And we have to look at metrics at all those levels. But as a product leader, we really need to understand how the metrics at the product level and at the user level drive that business level metric, more than we need to be looking at that top business level metric.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. That it's very helpful for sure. Um, oh, I want to ask you about failure for a little bit, and how to maybe, uh, when do we judge it a failure versus when do we sort of tweak things? Because we're talking about experiments. Part of the whole reason we're running an experiment is to see if something will work or will it not work. But it's an experiment. So, I think there's certain cases where maybe the data we're getting suggests, all right, whatever we're experimenting on, this doesn't work. But I would imagine there's also certain cases where if we made a simple tweak or two, the result would be way better. So how do you make that determination on whether it's something that, whatever kind of experiment you're running, something that should be tweaked, something should be modified, or something that we should be, moving on from altogether? I guess there's sort of a lot of different outcomes that could happen there. How do we know which direction to go?
Yeah, so you're sort of asking about like diagnosing a failed experiment and deciding what to do next, right? And I
Right.
think the thing is that you want to consider, did it fail because users didn't have the problem that you were trying to solve in the first place? Did it fail because your solution couldn't actually solve that problem for them? Or did it fail because they didn't know about it and they couldn't find it?
Hmm.
And so if you can figure out which of those it is, and usually the way to figure that out is some kind of qualitative assessment. So even if you were running an A/B test or put a new feature live and you're looking at product usage data, hopefully you have like a Hotjar installed, or you did some live watching of people using it as well. Like you've got that angle on it too, and you can use that to help you diagnose, well, is it that they didn't have the problem in the first place, or is it that they had the problem but this didn't solve it? And then you can figure out, do we need to go back to the drawing board about what problem to solve? Or do we need to just tweak the solution because the solution didn't get them there?
Yeah. And if we were to say, hey, there is a problem to be solved here, because then, like you said, we could potentially tweak to continue solving that problem. Is there a point where you go through so many tweaks where it's like, okay, this is enough tweaking. This is maybe we're not going to solve this particular problem. Like, how far do you go?
Yeah. Um, that absolutely can happen. And to be honest, I have had that happen. I've worked with many early stage startups, and I've been in early stage startups where we tweaked and tweaked and tweaked, and we never got to a place where we were adequately solving the problem. And the way that, you figure that out is typically, if it's just taking too many tries, right? Like, and unfortunately, there's the real reality of funding, right? And so at some point, you have a limited amount of time to prove that you can solve the problem. And if you can't make headway into it, you're not going to get more funding either from your investors or from your boss who's investing in the project at your company. If you're the one in the position trying to decide whether to continue the funding or not, I think the thing to be looking at is, are they generating interesting new insights from the experiments they're running that give them, something to hang on to with, well, we're going to try this next time, it might work. Or are they just like spinning their wheels, just trying anything without a real insight driven behind it?
Yeah. Yeah. And it might be one of those things where you start to feel it, right? It's like the first set of experiments, couple experiments you're running. I don't know. I just think back from times where it's been the case for me too. Like you're excited about it, like, all right, we're not there quite yet, but let's get, then there gets to be a point where you know it when you feel it. Like, okay, it's
Mhm.
just not working. So that could be one of those things too that helps us judge that.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you're starting to run out of ideas, that's one of the things that you might find where you feel like it's not working.
Yeah. I also wanted to ask you about sort of short term versus long term. Especially many of us, we might be working on products where we have the mainstay product itself and the mainstay features within that product, and we're trying to make it better. We're trying to optimize and for the long term. Then there's also new features we're working on, maybe new products we're working on, and there are pieces in the short term we're trying to optimize for or run experiments on. How do you balance sort of those short term experiments, if you will, versus longer term overall product health experiments in terms of where are you going to focus your time? And then over time, like, how are you approaching those experiments differently?
Yeah. So I'm a big believer in the three horizons model, where it's like 70% is short term, things we can keep doing. 20% is more medium term, like stuff that might play out but is early stage, and 10% is that like those long term bets, right? So I think you have to kind of bucket your experimentation into these categories, and you should always have some things that you're, like maybe it's not every sprint, but at least every quarter, you should have some sessions where you're thinking about, well, what if we were to just like rethink this? If we wanted to try something totally different, like what would that be? So that you are pushing yourself to do more than just optimization. But of course, this also varies depending on what stage and size of company you're in. There are certainly companies where people have a very optimization focused role and other people have a very experimentation focused role. And so that distribution might be across people as opposed to within one PM. But if you're in a smaller organization, then one PM needs to manage that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's helpful. I appreciate that. Have another audience question that came in, and this is a good one. It's focusing on that ideation stage when you're pushing to get to market. Question is just, how often should you be running experiments? And probably a big question, right? Because especially in that early ideation stage, trying to get to market, there's so many different types of experiments you can run. So I guess I'll ask the question as they asked it, how often should you run them? But maybe how do you prioritize the types of experiments you should be running at that stage too?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll answer both. So the how often you should run them is constantly. Like you should be running some kind of experiment every single week, honestly, if you're in a super early stage, because you are in the stage where the risk is the greatest. And if you're not de-risking through experimentation, you run the risk of flopping when you get to market, and it's your job to de-risk that. But how do you figure out which things you're going to focus on? Because you might have a lot of different ideas. I'm a big fan of running a pre-mortem risk assessment. That's an exercise that I teach. You can also find, some other people teach versions of it as well. And it's an exercise where you come together with your product team, with your designer, your engineers, people who are really close to the customer, maybe some stakeholders, and you generate ideas about how things are going to fail, and then you prioritize them. And the way that I like to prioritize them is based on a matrix of impact versus likelihood of happening. So everything that is both high likelihood of happening and high impact is the riskiest stuff. And then you can systematically say, okay, let me take the riskiest thing and let me think about how I can run an experiment that will help me better understand this.
Yeah. Well, I have maybe one more question, and then I have a very quick hit, kind of lightning round question. But we're talking about metrics that we're running as product people, product teams. But I know there's others in the organization, other stakeholders, the C-suite, the marketing team, sales team. They're probably very interested about those experiments and how they're going. What's your advice for how to share the results of those metrics, knowing that like maybe, there might be some reading between the lines that needs to happen? How can we help sort of the rest of the organization know what to do even with those results of experiments we're running?
Yeah, great question. So there's a couple main ways that I teach to do that. So the first one is to have some kind of share out with those key stakeholders, with the head of marketing, the head of sales, et cetera. That typically happens maybe on a monthly basis or so, depending on how much you're learning and how fast, where you just share with them what you've been learning and how the metrics are moving. And I like to do both together because I like to focus on the fact that like metrics don't move in a vacuum. They move because you learned things and then you applied the things that you learned. And so I like to share all of that together, and really give them the context behind why we chose that metric and how it impacts the metrics that they care about. And then the other piece is I have a more frequent meeting with your team itself. So I recommend taking your sprint demo and making it what I call a built learned planning demo, where you, in addition to sharing what you built, you also share what you learned and what you're planning. And at that demo, you also include the key metrics that you're measuring and how those have changed from week to week.
Yeah. Great. Well, look, I know we're coming up at the end of our discussion here. So this is just the last question, because sometimes it's like the last thing that we hear that really sticks with us. So if there's one big takeaway that you hope people get from this session, what would you want that to be?
I want them to think about how are they measuring whether the user is getting the value that the user cares about from the product. So is the user getting to their desired outcome? How closely can you measure that? Measure the growth of user value.
Yeah, that's a great way to end it for sure. And Holly, I really appreciate you taking the time. I want people to be able to keep tabs on your work and what you're doing. I'm going to send everybody a link where they can do that. But maybe you could just say it here. If people wanted to keep tabs on your work, where would they go to follow you?
Yeah, so productsciencegroup.com, that's my company. You can go there and sign up for our newsletter. You can also follow me and the company on LinkedIn. Those are the best places.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to share those links when I follow up with everybody, and I'll include a recording for everybody too. So no worries on that if you didn't catch that. But Holly, just again, thank you so much for taking the time, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in New York again, April 18th at the New York Product Conference.
Yeah, I hope some of you will be there.
Awesome. Awesome. Well,
All right.
thanks everybody for joining us, and I will see you at our next session.